Joining us now is American historian Professor Gil Troy. Professor Troy has authored 13 books, including his latest, The Zionist Ideas. He's also a columnist for the Jerusalem Post and an esteemed professor of history at McGill University in Canada. Now, Professor Troy, I'd like to give you the stage to pose your own question to Professor Dershowitz, so it's all yours.
Professor Dershowitz, a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for being one of the Zionist thinkers in my new book, The Zionist Ideas. 1959, when that book came out, Israel was fragile, but the Zionist conversation was robust. Today, in 2018, Israel is robust, but the Zionist conversation is fragile. What's happened?
Well, what happens is what happens with every movement. When a movement succeeds, its theoretical underpinnings become less important. That happened during the American Revolution. It happened during many, many other important events in history. You need a movement to generate a state, but once a state gets established, the theory becomes far, far less important, and pragmatics and compromises become far, far more important. I think if you did a comparable history, spirit of 1776 in the United States, and then compared it to Adams and Jefferson bickering over the 1800 election, you'll see very, very, very similar changes. I think they're inevitable. I don't think they're necessarily positive. I think it's important to keep the spirit of Zionism alive. I think young people don't understand Zionism, don't understand how important it is, both in theory and practice, to be a vibrant nation of the Jewish people. And that's why I think your books and your writings have contributed so much to the dialogue.
Well, you know, that kind of leads us to our next question, which is almost natural. Why has it become almost a taboo to be a Zionist in this day and age? And can you define also what a Zionist is for those who may be confused about the literal definition?
So first, to define it, Zionism starts with the notion that we are a people. Jews aren't just a religion, but we're a people and a religion. In some ways, we're an Oreo cookie. Just like an Oreo cookie has the cookie part and the cream part, and that's what makes it an Oreo cookie. The Jews are a nation and a religion. As a nation, we have ties to a particular homeland. And that homeland and that tie doesn't necessarily mean that others might also have tie to that land. But we have a tie to that homeland. And then we can build a nation state, like 192 other countries in the United Nations have built nation states. And so it's people, land, state. That was to establish the state. And now the challenge is to perfect the state, and even more so, to also find, as Professor Dershowitz was suggesting, find meaning in that state. And why are we in trouble? Partially, I say shame on them, that there's a systematic campaign to delegitimize Israel and Zionism. But also shame on us. I think it's not only that the revolution got a little tired because it succeeded, I think we've also internalized so much of the negativity, and like oppressed Jews, rather than overcoming the attacks, overcoming the oppression, we've internalized it and said, oh, if we're so unpopular, there must be something wrong with us, as opposed to something wrong with them. And I want identity Zionism. I want us to look at Israel, look at a nation state as a source of inspiration wherever we live.
I think that's right. And I go out of my way not to call myself just a supporter of Israel, but an ardent Zionist. When I spoke in Qatar recently at Northwestern University, there were protests saying, Zionists go home. And the guy sitting next to me kind of whispered and said, well, tell me you're not a Zionist, you just support Israel. And I stood up and I said, I am a Zionist, and I'm proud of my Zionism. I think one of the problems, Professor, is with your Oreo cookie. So that in the beginning, the Oreo cookie was comprised mostly of a secular nationalism, the nation state of the Jewish people. The religious component was almost symbolic. Obviously, the flag of Israel was based on the Talit. The Star of David is a biblical star. But Israel and Zionism was a secular enterprise. And the religious component was far less important. Indeed, some very religious people were anti-Zionist because the Mashiach hadn't yet come. And of course, the great prayer for Israel, which talks about the beginning of our redemption, was a compromise, as was Ben-Gurion's compromise about religious law with the chief rabbinate. Well, things have changed dramatically, and the religious elements of Israel have played a much more powerful role in the growth of the Haredi community, and I don't think that's been a healthy development for Zionism, all for Israel. And I think for the spirit of Zionism to be restored, every Israeli can do public service, whether in the military or outside the military. Every Israeli has to be fully a participant in Israel. And I think the idea of having a group in the economy that doesn't put its weight and instead just performs religious services is a violation of Herzl's notion, which he wrote about in The Jewish State, that rabbis must be kept in their temples. And I think we see far too much influence today of religion on state governance.
I agree with you, because I think the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, have forgotten part of the Oreo cookie too. They've taken the nation part out. And the balance that I'm talking about is one that many of the Zionists did have, because you're right, there was a sense of a secular rebellion, but in many ways it was rebellion against the rabbis. And in my book, The Zionist Ideas, and I added the S as a way of broadening the conversation, religious, non-religious, left, right, people like Rav Kook, people like Rabbi David Hartman, older and younger, all say that the religious dimension was also an important dimension. We came back to this land, not just any land. We came back to this language, Hebrew, which had been the language of sacred speak, and now is also the language of every day. And so it's that balance. And when I talk about religion, I don't talk about it in the sense of the way the rabbinate has hijacked it, in the way the ultra-Orthodox have distorted it. I'm talking about in the rich, full sense that you feel in Israel of a constant dance between old, new, as Theodor Herzl said, alt, neu, the old represented by the tradition and the new represented by the secular revolution, the modern revolution. And many of your writings speak to that. And that's one of the reasons why you're such a hero to so many of us on both sides of the Atlantic.
You put it so beautifully. I think that's absolutely right. But when there's a conflict between the old and the new, the old doesn't get a veto. It gets a vote, but it doesn't get a veto. And look, I'm coming to Israel next week with my grandson. The first place we're going to go as soon as the plane lands is to the Kotel. My grandson is not religious, but I wanted to see, and he wants to see, the great symbol of the Jewish past. And we'll immerse ourselves in Jewish history, religious and secular. But at bottom, decisions have to be made on a governance basis, not on a religious basis.
Well, religious or secular, there are some that assume that being Jewish means that you are inherently Zionist. Is that true?
Well, we see, for example, with these ultra-Orthodox who have embarrassed all of us with their rejection of certain core Zionist ideas, core national ideas, that you can definitely be Jewish and not Zionist. Zionism is a movement and is an idea, but I would say that to truly understand the richness and the fullness of Jewish history, the richness and fullness of the Jewish past, the richness and fullness of Jewish civilization, you need to be somewhere on the dance, somewhere with both sides of that cookie. And I hope that your grandson enjoys both sides and sees the inspiration we can get from this 3,500-year-old conversation we've been a part of.
I think you're right, but let me give you two examples, one a positive, one a negative. So take Chabad. Chabad is a wonderful organization. I've worked with it very closely on prisoners' rights, on many of the rights. Now, you cannot say that Chabad is a, quote, Zionist organization because, in theory, it doesn't necessarily accept the concept of Zionism. There's no pro-Israel organization today on college and university campuses. They just don't have a litmus test for who joins Chabad. You don't have to be a card-carrying Zionist to do it. All you have to do is love the Jewish people, love the nation state of the Jewish people, and you're welcome at Chabad. In fact, Chabad even welcomes people who are anti-Zionist. But then contrast that with a horrible organization called the Jewish Voice for Peace, which pretends to be a Jewish organization. It's an anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel organization, which would love nothing more than to see the end of the nation state of the Jewish people. But by calling itself Jewish, by using peace in its name, it pretends to speak for Jewish people as, fortunately, a small number of people, but its name and its label attract lots of young people because they want peace and they want to be Jewish. So this organization, much like Jews for Jesus, attracts people on the basis of absolutely false premises. So I don't think being a Zionist is the test of loving Israel, nor do I think even being Jewish is the test for loving Israel, but it is the nation state of the Jewish people.
Well, unfortunately, we are running low on time, so hopefully we can kind of wrap this up with the last question that's not too long. Professor Troy, in preparing for this program, you were looking at what direction Israel and its relationship to the diaspora should be moving. And before our show, you even quoted to me from a book written 20 years ago by Professor Dershowitz called The Vanishing American Jew. What are your thoughts on this subject, and what questions would you like to raise today?
Well, the passage came from that wonderful book, The Vanishing American Jew, and I put it in my book, The Zionist Ideas, because it really talks about the challenge that I think you'll be facing with your grandson next week, which is how do you convey Zionism? How do you explain this 3,500-year-old adventure to the next generation? And what I want us to do is not just get stuck in the politics, not just get stuck in the fight, but really talk about what I call identity Zionism, which is start with me, start with my life. Start with every one of us. What are our issues? Because I think the modern Jew and the modern human being is looking for roots, is looking for community, and to look at Zionism, look at Jewish nationalism as an opportunity to root ourselves and to connect to one another and to, in some ways, address the soul sickness that not just modern Jews have, but many modern Westerners have.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And I think the other point that has to be made is that we are living in a world which is moving toward extremes. The left is moving further left in its anti-Zionist rhetoric. The right is moving further right in some of its anti-Semitic rhetoric. And historically, Jews have always been caught between the black and the red, the black of fascism and the red of communism. And we all have an obligation to move us closer to the center. And Zionism was always a centrist philosophy. Israel was born by the pen, not the sword. It had to defend itself by the sword. It was born by the pen. It was born of theory, born of commitment, and born of desire to create a centrist, modern, liberal society. And I don't mean liberal in the sense of liberal conservative, but just open society. And I hope we can convey the true sense of what Zionism is and how proud we should all be of being part of the Zionist experiment.
All right, well, on that note, we have to end the show. It's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Dershowitz. And of course, I would like to thank our guests, Seth Frantzman and Gil Troy. If you would like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to ILTV or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.